The autumn rain drizzled softly over the quiet streets of Maplewood, a small coastal town where the waves whispered secrets against the rocks. Inside an old white cottage at the end of Harbor Lane, Evelyn Carter sat at the oak desk her late husband had built 40 years ago. The smell of cedar and old books lingered in the air. Before her lay a letter written in her husband's familiar hand. Thomas Carter, the man who had once filled every corner of her life with laughter. Thomas had passed away 3 weeks ago after a sudden heart attack, leaving behind not only silence, but a truth Evelyn had never expected to face. Evelyn was 62, tall and slender, with hair the color of silver ash that framed her soft, yet resolute face. Her eyes, a calm gray blue, often carried that distant sadness of someone who had loved deeply and lost too much. She had always been known in town for her warmth, her pies that won the county fair 3 years in a row, and her quiet dignity. But now, sitting alone in the dim light of her study, Evelyn felt as if her heart had been hollowed out. Her trembling fingers unfolded the letter. My dearest Evelyn, if one day Grace loses her way, promise me you won't save her with money. Let her fall, let her rise. Only then will she understand what truly matters. You've always protected her from every storm, but some storms, my love, are necessary. Evelyn pressed the letter to her chest. The ink had faded slightly, but Thomas's voice was alive between the lines. She looked toward the window, where the rain slid down the glass like tears. Grace, their only daughter, was 28, ambitious, beautiful, and utterly consumed by the hunger for status. Grace Carter had inherited her father's sharp mind, but not his humility. She was striking, shoulder-length auburn hair, deep green eyes that once sparkled with curiosity, but now burned with restless ambition. She had just married Mark Davis, a successful real estate developer in New York, tall, charismatic, and always impeccably dressed. His confidence was magnetic, though beneath it lingered a certain arrogance that Evelyn had never trusted. The last time Evelyn saw her daughter was 6 months earlier, on Grace's wedding day. Grace wore a satin gown that shimmered like moonlight. When Evelyn reached out to adjust her veil, Grace had said with a strained smile, "Mom, please, the stylist will handle it." That was the first time Evelyn felt truly unnecessary in her daughter's world. Now, 2 months after the funeral, Evelyn decided to visit her daughter in the city. She packed a small suitcase, tucked Thomas's letter inside her purse, and boarded the 6 a.m. train to Manhattan. The city roared around her when she arrived, taxis honking, people rushing, glass towers stabbing at the clouds. Grace lived in a luxurious penthouse on the Upper East Side. Evelyn had only been there once, when the apartment was still new. When Grace opened the door, she looked surprised. Not happily so. "Mom, you should have called." "I wanted to see you," Evelyn said softly. "And Mark." Grace sighed, stepping aside. "Fine, come in, but we're just about to head out for a dinner meeting." The apartment gleamed with modern elegance. Marble floors, golden accents, abstract art that probably cost more than Evelyn's entire home. Yet beneath the shine, there was no warmth. Mark appeared from the hallway, adjusting his cufflinks. He was handsome in a sculpted magazine-perfect way. Square jaw, dark hair slicked back, sharp brown eyes that measured people like assets. "Mrs. Carter," he greeted politely. "Sorry we can't stay long. Grace mentioned your loss. I'm truly sorry." Evelyn nodded. "Thank you, Mark." Mark kissed Grace's cheek, whispered something in her ear, and left. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime. Grace poured herself a glass of wine and sat opposite her mother. "So?" she said, crossing her legs. You've been alone these past weeks? Evelyn smiled faintly. The neighbors have been kind. I've been managing. Grace tilted her head. You should sell the house, Mom. It's too big for one person. You could move closer to me, maybe a small apartment downtown? I like it there, Evelyn replied. It's home. Grace sighed impatiently. Mom, that place is ancient. You can't live on nostalgia forever. You need to be practical. You know, not everyone wants to be stuck in Maplewood their whole life. Evelyn's heart tightened. Grace, Maplewood is where your father and I built everything we loved. It's where you took your first steps, where we planted the magnolia tree. Grace interrupted, voice rising slightly. Mom, please, you don't understand my world anymore. Success isn't about sentimentality. It's about moving forward. The words struck Evelyn like cold water. For a moment, she said nothing. She looked at her daughter, the glossy hair, the expensive clothes, the faint air of superiority that surrounded her like perfume. Grace, she said gently, you're chasing something that can't fill you. Grace laughed, not cruelly, but with disbelief. And what's that supposed to mean? Poverty builds character? Nobody said anything about poverty. Evelyn's voice was soft, but steady. But don't mistake wealth for worth. Grace's smile faded. Mom, I love you, but you don't get it. You grew up in a different time. Things are different now, and honestly, I don't want your small-town lectures in my life anymore. Silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. Evelyn felt her heart shatter, not with anger, but with sorrow. She stood up slowly, her voice trembling. Then I won't stay where I'm not wanted. Grace looked startled. Mom, I didn't mean... But Evelyn was already at the door. Take care of yourself, darling. I hope you find what you're looking for. The elevator doors closed, and the city swallowed her again. That night, Evelyn sat by the window of her small hotel room, watching the rain blur the skyline. She pulled out Thomas's letter once more. Let her find her own way. She folded the paper carefully, placed it back in her purse, and whispered into the silence. Then that's what I'll do. The next morning, before the sun rose, Evelyn checked out of the hotel, withdrew her savings, and disappeared from Grace's life, leaving no address, no phone number, and no clue of her plans. The morning fog clung low over Manhattan, softening the edges of skyscrapers like ghosts in a dream. Grace Davis stood by the window of her penthouse, staring at the city she once ruled with pride. The skyline, once a symbol of her ambition, now felt like a wall closing in. The silence inside the apartment was suffocating. No laughter, no clinking glasses, no Mark. Just emptiness. It had been 3 years since her mother, Evelyn, vanished without a trace. 3 years since Grace had thrown her pride like a weapon, cutting the last thread that tied her to family. She had built a new life with Mark, or so she believed. He had been her everything. Her husband, her business partner, her proof to the world that she had made it. Together, they launched a luxury interior design firm called Davis & Co., hosting parties where champagne flowed like water and investors praised their vision. Grace thrived in that world of glittering deception, until everything crumbled. It started with whispers. A client complained that funds had gone missing, then another. Soon, her assistant, a nervous young woman named Clara Jenkins, with chestnut hair and timid brown eyes, came into her office holding a trembling stack of papers. Mrs. Davis, she said softly, you should see this. The financial report was a graveyard of red numbers. Millions gone, bank accounts drained. The signature at the bottom of each withdrawal, Mark's. That night, Grace came home to find his side of the closet empty. The expensive suits, the gold cufflinks, the cologne bottle, gone. Only a short note lay on the bed. "I'm sorry, Grace. It was never supposed to end this way. Don't look for me." The world she had built on pride and illusion shattered like glass. Days turned into weeks. The police launched an investigation, but Mark Davis had vanished. Rumor spread fast in New York's elite circles. The golden couple was ruined. Clients backed out, journalists called for statements, and soon creditors demanded repayment. Grace tried to fight, to hold on, but her empire was already ash. She sold her diamond rings, then her designer clothes, then finally the penthouse itself. Every sale stripped away another layer of the woman she thought she was. When she handed over the apartment keys to a realtor, she barely recognized her reflection in the glass door. Pale, hollow-eyed, a ghost of her former self. Her once shiny auburn hair now hung limp, and her green eyes carried that dull glaze of exhaustion and shame. One evening, after signing the final document transferring her last asset, Grace sat in a cheap motel room near the train station. Her suitcase, a single piece of faded leather, lay beside her. She had nowhere left to go. The city that once adored her had spat her out. She looked out the small window, where rain streaked down the glass, and whispered to the night, "I have no one." But deep inside, a faint memory stirred. A white cottage by the sea, the scent of magnolias, and her mother's voice calling her name. The next morning, Grace boarded a southbound train to Maplewood. The journey was long and quiet. Outside, the landscape shifted from glass towers to green hills, from chaos to calm. With each passing mile, she felt her pride peeling away like old paint. By the time she arrived, dusk had fallen. The air smelled of salt and pine. She dragged her suitcase through the narrow streets until she saw it. The old Carter cottage, paint slightly chipped, garden overgrown but alive. Warm light glowed through the window, spilling onto the porch. Grace hesitated. Her hands trembled. She almost turned back. But before she could, the door creaked open. Evelyn stood there. Her mother looked older, but in a graceful way. Her silver hair was pulled into a loose bun, and her simple gray sweater hung loosely on her frame. There was flour on her hands. She had been baking, as always. Her calm blue eyes met Grace's, unblinking, filled not with shock, but quiet knowing. Grace froze. Her lips parted, but no words came. "Hi, Mom," she finally whispered, her voice breaking. Evelyn didn't move for a moment. Then she stepped aside and said softly, "Come in. You need a bath and a proper meal." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was love, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken. Grace walked in, her legs weak. The house smelled of apple pie and old wood. Everything looked smaller than she remembered. The same worn furniture, the old clock ticking in the corner, the crocheted blanket on the couch. "Are you hungry?" Evelyn asked, her tone calm, almost businesslike. Grace nodded wordlessly. Evelyn set down a steaming bowl of chicken soup on the table. As Grace ate, tears blurred her vision. The warmth of the soup spread through her chest, melting the ice that had built up over years of pride and distance. "I'm sorry," Grace whispered between sobs. "I was wrong. About everything." Evelyn didn't reply immediately. She sat across from her daughter, watching with a gentle sadness. "You don't have to say anything now," she said at last. "Just rest. Tomorrow is another day." That night, Grace slept in her childhood room, the one with faded pink walls and old posters she once adored. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ocean outside. For the first time in years, she felt safe. Yet something inside her twisted painfully. How could her mother still be so kind, after all the cruelty Grace had shown? The next morning, she woke to the sound of birds and the smell of coffee. Evelyn was already in the kitchen, wearing an old apron, humming softly. Grace joined her. "Mom," she said hesitantly, how have you been all these years?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "Oh, managing. My pension covers enough. I do some knitting for the local store. Nothing glamorous." Grace frowned. "Pension? Are you sure you're okay? I could—" She stopped herself. She had nothing left to offer. Evelyn nodded. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I've learned to live simply. It's peaceful." Grace looked around the modest kitchen. The old kettle, the chipped plates, the faded curtains. Guilt clawed at her chest. She had chased luxury while her mother lived alone with so little. She whispered, "You shouldn't have to live like this." Evelyn smiled again, that same quiet smile that hid more than it revealed. Sometimes a small life can hold more happiness than a big one. Grace lowered her gaze. "I don't deserve to be here." Her mother reached across the table and took her hand. "Grace, this house will always be yours to come home to. That's what family means." And for the first time in her adult life, Grace broke completely. She cried. Not for Mark, not for the lost money, but for the years she had wasted chasing illusions when real love had always been right here. Outside, the fog lifted slowly, revealing a bright blue sky over Maplewood. For Evelyn, watching her daughter cry was like watching a storm finally pass. She knew Thomas had been right. Grace had needed to fall before she could stand again. But what Grace didn't know yet was that her mother's modest life was a carefully woven disguise. The truth and the lesson had only begun. The morning wind from the Atlantic carried the scent of salt and damp earth. The sky was pale gray, the kind that pressed low over the small coastal town of Maplewood, making everything feel both fragile and endless. Grace Davis stood on the porch of her mother's cottage, clutching a worn notebook where she had written the names of local businesses. Each page was filled with job openings she had already tried and been rejected from. Her reflection in the window showed a tired woman in her early 30s, her once flawless complexion now pale, her lips dry, her auburn hair tied into a messy knot. She looked nothing like the confident socialite she had once been. For weeks, Grace had walked from one end of town to the other, searching for work. But Maplewood was small, and gossip traveled fast. Everyone had heard of the city woman who lost her fortune. They smiled politely, but avoided hiring her. The small bookstore didn't need help. The cafe wanted someone with experience. Even the florist, Mrs. Keaton, a kindly woman with white curls and a floral apron, had offered only pity. "I'm sorry, dear. My niece just took the position." Grace thanked her and walked out, feeling invisible. By the third week, her pride had thinned like paper. She sat at the kitchen table one morning, staring at the classified ads, her fingers tracing words she never imagined would apply to her: housekeeper, dishwasher, laundry assistant. Evelyn poured her a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "Any luck?" she asked gently. Grace forced a smile. "Not yet, but I'll find something soon." Evelyn didn't press. She had learned long ago that her daughter needed to come to terms with reality at her own pace. Instead, she folded laundry silently, occasionally glancing at Grace with quiet empathy. Evelyn's silver hair glowed in the morning light, her calm face showing no trace of judgment, only patience. That afternoon, Grace walked into the Maplewood Seaside Inn, a weathered two-story hotel perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. Its white paint had chipped from years of salt air, and a faded sign hung at the entrance. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and old carpet. Behind the reception desk stood Mr. Harold Whitmore, the manager, a stout man in his late 50s with thinning blonde hair, small spectacles perched on his nose, and a permanent crease between his brows that hinted at decades of stress. He wore a neat gray vest and spoke with the efficiency of someone who had seen too many people come and go. Grace approached timidly. "Excuse me, sir. I saw the sign outside. You're hiring?" Mr. Whitmore looked her up and down, assessing her expensive coat and delicate hands. "You don't look like the type who scrubs floors," he said flatly. Grace swallowed. "I can learn." He sighed, tapping his pen against the counter. "We've had girls quit after a week. The work's hard. Rooms need to be cleaned, sheets changed, bathrooms scrubbed. We start early, no exceptions." "I'll take it," Grace said before he could finish. He blinked, surprised. "You start tomorrow at 7. Ask for Marta. She'll show you what to do." The next morning, Grace arrived at the inn before sunrise. The ocean was still a silver blur, and the air was cold enough to sting her cheeks. She met Marta Rodriguez, a woman in her 40s with warm brown skin, short black hair, and a solid build that spoke of years of physical labor. Marta's eyes were sharp but kind. She wore a plain blue uniform and rubber gloves tucked into her belt. "So, you're the new one," Marta said, handing Grace a bucket and mop. "You ever cleaned 12 rooms in a day?" Grace shook her head. "Then today's your education," Marta said, smirking. By noon, Grace's arms ached. Her back screamed from bending, scrubbing, and hauling linens up narrow staircases. The scent of bleach clung to her skin. Marta moved with practiced rhythm, humming while she worked. Grace, trying to keep up, spilled water twice and broke a glass once. Marta didn't scold her, just chuckled softly. "Don't worry, the floor doesn't bite, but it does humble you." When the day ended, Grace dragged herself home, her hair damp with sweat, her uniform clinging to her skin. Evelyn was waiting with a pot of stew simmering on the stove. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the small kitchen. "How was it?" Evelyn asked, without turning from the pot. Grace collapsed into a chair. "It was awful. My hands hurt, my back hurts, and I smell like a cleaning product." Evelyn smiled faintly. "That means you worked hard." Grace wanted to snap back but couldn't. She felt too tired, too hollow. For the first time, she truly understood what exhaustion felt like. The kind that reached the soul. The days passed in a blur of mops, sheets, and soap. Each morning, Grace rose before dawn and walked to the inn under the pale sky. Her soft hands developed calluses. Her nails, once manicured, were now chipped and rough. And yet, something subtle began to shift inside her. She started to appreciate the quiet rhythm of labor, the smell of clean linen, the sound of waves through open windows, the satisfaction of finishing a room perfectly. Marta noticed it too. "You're learning," Marta said one afternoon, handing her a towel. "Not bad for a city princess." Grace laughed weakly. "That's a new title." Marta smiled. "You'll earn the real ones later. Hard worker, reliable, those are better than rich." At night, Grace would return to her mother's cottage. Evelyn always had dinner ready. Simple meals, but full of care. She never asked about the job, never offered pity. She just listened when Grace spoke. One night, after a particularly grueling day, Grace finally broke. She pushed her half-eaten soup away and covered her face with trembling hands. "Mom," she whispered, her voice raw. "I hate this life. I hate waking up every morning just to clean other people's mess. I don't deserve this." Evelyn watched her quietly. Then she spoke in a calm, measured tone. "No one deserves or doesn't deserve grace. We all live according to the consequences of our choices." The words cut deep. Grace lifted her head, eyes glistening. "Are you saying this is my fault?" "I'm saying," Evelyn replied softly, "that every road we walk was paved by our own steps. You wanted to build a life of luxury, and when it collapsed, this is where you landed. It doesn't make you less. It makes you human." Grace stared at her mother, speechless. She had spent so long blaming Mark, fate, and luck. The thought that her own choices had led her here was unbearable, yet strangely freeing. She wept silently as Evelyn placed a hand over hers. "Pain," Evelyn said, "isn't punishment. It's education." That night, Grace lay awake, the words echoing in her mind. For the first time, she saw her mother not as a fragile old woman, but as someone quietly powerful. A woman who had suffered, learned, and lived with dignity. Days turned into weeks. Grace grew stronger, both in body and spirit. She began to smile more, even laugh with Marta. When the hotel guests left generous tips, she saved them in a small jar. Evelyn noticed the difference. Her daughter's posture was straighter now, her eyes clearer. One evening, as the sun dipped into the sea, Grace stood outside the inn, watching waves crash against the shore. Her hands still ached, but it was a good kind of pain. The kind that told her she was changing. And somewhere deep inside, for the first time in years, she felt proud. The afternoon sun glowed faintly through the salt-streaked windows of the seaside inn, soft light glimmering on the dull brass handles of the doors. The air smelled of lemon disinfectant and the faint musk of the ocean beyond. Grace Carter tied her hair into a low bun, wiped her forehead, and pushed her cleaning cart down the narrow corridor. It had been 6 months since she started working here. Long enough for her hands to grow calloused and her pride to wear thin. The work was repetitive, but it gave her something that luxury never had: silence. Room 214 was her least favorite. It always took longer. The guest there, Mrs. Helen Moore, liked things a certain way. The towels folded in perfect squares, the coffee capsules arranged by color. Helen was in her 70s, elegant in a way that made people look twice. She had snow-white hair, always pinned up with a silver comb, a posture that spoke of an old kind of grace, and a soft perfume of lavender that lingered long after she left. Helen was a widow who had once been a lawyer in Chicago, but after her husband's death, she spent half the year traveling between small towns, claiming it helped her remember what life felt like. That morning, Helen was sitting by the window when Grace entered. "Oh, there you are, dear," she said with a smile. "I was hoping it would be you. The others never remember how I like my curtains." Grace smiled politely. "Of course, Mrs. Moore." She began dusting, moving around quietly, but Helen, as usual, wanted to talk. "You know," Helen began, "your mother and I go way back. Evelyn Carter, yes? I recognized you the first week you started here. You looked just like her when she was young. Determined eyes, that little stubborn tilt of the chin." Grace froze mid-wipe. "You knew my mother?" she asked cautiously. Helen chuckled. "Oh, very well. We both sat on the board of the Redwood Timber Company years ago. Fine woman, Evelyn. Strong, smart with business." Grace blinked, confused. "My mother? A businesswoman?" Helen nodded, not noticing Grace's discomfort. "Oh, indeed. That woman could turn $1 into 10. Redwood was her pride. When she sold it, people said she made a small fortune. I suppose that's what let her retire early." The feather duster trembled slightly in Grace's hand. "She sold a company?" she asked, her voice thin. "I thought she just had a pension. She told me she barely gets by." Helen frowned. "That doesn't sound like Evelyn, unless she's hiding something from you." The older woman looked at Grace's pale face and softened her tone. "Maybe I shouldn't have said anything, dear. You mustn't take it too seriously. Time changes people." But Grace wasn't listening anymore. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. The image of her mother, kind, wrinkled, always wearing the same faded cardigan, collided violently with this new revelation of a woman who once owned a successful company. The lie gnawed at her chest. That night, when Grace returned home, Evelyn was sitting by the fireplace, reading. The small house was dimly lit, smelling of chamomile and wood smoke. "You're home late," Evelyn said softly, glancing up. Grace dropped her bag onto the floor. Her voice shook. "Why didn't you tell me?" Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Tell you what, dear? That you had money? That you owned a company? That you're not poor?" For a moment, silence fell so thick it pressed against the walls. Evelyn slowly set her book down. "Who told you that?" Grace's hands clenched. "Helen Moore. She said you were on the board of some timber company, Redwood. Is that true?" Evelyn sighed. "Yes, it's true." Grace's voice cracked, sharp with pain. "So you lied. All this time, you let me scrub floors, humiliate myself, thinking you couldn't help me. Why, Mom? Was this all some test?" Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "It wasn't a test." Grace laughed bitterly. "Then what was it? Some twisted way to make me see the truth about life? You could have saved me from everything. From the debts, from Mark, from—" Her voice broke. Evelyn stood slowly, her gray hair catching the firelight. "Grace, you think I didn't want to save you? Every night I wanted to write you a check, to pull you out of the mess. But your father's letter—" She stopped herself. Grace stared. "Dad? What does he have to do with this?" Evelyn turned away, walking to the mantelpiece. There, in a small wooden box, she pulled out a folded letter yellowed with age. "This is the last letter your father wrote before he passed. He asked me not to interfere with your life using money. He wanted you to grow strong enough to stand without it." Evelyn's voice quivered slightly. "He said love should lift you, not rescue you." Grace's anger melted into confusion and heartbreak. "So you just watched me drown?" Evelyn met her daughter's eyes, calm but heavy with sorrow. "No, I watched you learn to swim." The fireplace crackled, and Grace sank into a chair, trembling. All her pride, her anger, her exhaustion came pouring out in tears. "I hated you, Mom," she whispered. "When Mark left, when I was scrubbing hotel floors, I hated you so much." Evelyn nodded slowly. "I know." "And you didn't even try to explain." Evelyn's eyes glistened. "Would you have listened?" Grace looked away. She remembered how she once dismissed her mother as simple, small-minded, unworthy. Now the shame was unbearable. Evelyn came closer, kneeling beside her. "Grace, I never wanted you to live in pain. But pain isn't always a punishment. Sometimes it's how we grow. You're still my daughter. Not my project, not my lesson." Grace's lips trembled. "I don't know if I can forgive you." Evelyn nodded again, her face soft. "You don't have to. Not yet. Forgiveness isn't something you owe me. It's something that will come when you see why I did it." The room fell quiet, except for the whisper of the wind outside. Grace stared into the fire until her eyes blurred. In the flickering orange light, she saw flashes of her old life. The diamond bracelets, the parties, the hollow laughter, and for the first time, they looked distant, almost foolish. That night, Long after Evelyn had gone to bed, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table, the letter from her father lying open before her. The ink was fading, but one line stood out clearly. If Grace ever loses her way, let her find her path, not through our wealth, but through her own will. She read it over and over until tears dropped onto the paper, blurring the words. Outside, the waves crashed against the shore, steady and patient, as if echoing her mother's quiet strength. A thin fog rolled in from the sea that morning, wrapping the small coastal town in a gray silence. The air smelled of damp salt and distant rain. Grace Carter zipped up her worn jacket, slung her bag over her shoulder, and left her mother's house without a word. Her chest felt tight, her steps unsteady on the gravel road. The world seemed colder than usual, though she couldn't tell if it was the weather or the emptiness inside her. Evelyn had tried to speak before she left, but Grace couldn't bear to hear another calm, reasonable explanation. She needed distance, not from her mother's house, but from the weight of her own confusion. She rented a room above a laundromat near the edge of town, a narrow space with cracked walls and a single small window that faced the ocean. The landlady, Mrs. Peterson, was a short, round woman with gray curls and a voice roughened by cigarettes. "No loud music, no visitors after 10, she said when handing Grace the keys. Grace nodded. The rent was cheap, but the room smelled faintly of detergent and loneliness. Days bled into weeks. Grace worked double shifts at the Seaside Inn, cleaning rooms, carrying laundry, and helping in the kitchen when short-staffed. Her hands grew red and rough, her back ached, and her pride dissolved into quiet endurance. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she'd catch herself thinking of her mother. The calm look in Evelyn's eyes, the way she never raised her voice even when Grace shouted. That composure had once infuriated Grace. Now it haunted her. Helen Moore still stayed in room 214. Her health had been declining lately. Her steps slower, her face paler under the elegant layers of makeup. Yet her dignity remained unshaken. Getting old is a negotiation with pain, she once told Grace with a wry smile. Grace found herself staying longer in Helen's room after cleaning, chatting briefly about books or weather. Helen reminded her of something Evelyn had, a quiet strength beneath gentleness. It unsettled her. One rainy afternoon, when thunder rolled far over the sea, Grace finished cleaning the last room on the second floor. She passed by room 214 and noticed the door slightly ajar. "Mrs. Moore?" she called, knocking lightly. No answer. A cold instinct twisted in her stomach. She pushed the door open and gasped. Helen was lying on the carpet near the bed, one hand clutching the nightstand, her face pale and strained. Grace rushed forward. "Mrs. Moore, can you hear me?" Helen groaned softly. "My leg slipped when I tried to reach the phone." Grace knelt beside her, heart pounding. She checked for injuries. The older woman's ankle was swollen, her breathing labored but steady. "Don't move," Grace said, trying to sound calm. "I'm calling for help." She sprinted to the reception, shouting for someone to call an ambulance. But the hotel manager was gone for lunch, and the front desk clerk, a nervous young man named Brian, froze, unsure what to do. Without waiting, Grace ran back, grabbed her phone, and dialed emergency services. Her hands trembled as she relayed the situation. The operator's calm voice steadied her, guiding her through what to do. She fetched pillows, supported Helen's leg, and waited, holding the woman's cold hand. Helen's eyes fluttered open. "You're still here," she murmured. "Of course I'm here," Grace said softly. "Where else would I be?" Helen smiled faintly. You remind me of your mother more than you think. The paramedics arrived. 2 men in blue uniforms, one tall and broad-shouldered with a trimmed beard, the other younger and freckled, barely out of his 20s. The older one, Sam, nodded approvingly at Grace. You did good, miss. Keeping her legs steady like that might have prevented worse damage. Grace's heart slowed as she watched them lift Helen onto the stretcher. Will she be okay? She asked. She'll need rest, Sam said. But she'll be fine. When the ambulance left, Grace stood in the empty hallway, drenched in sweat and rainwater. Her reflection in the glass door startled her. She looked stronger somehow, less fragile, though her eyes still carried the tiredness of years lost to pride. She went back upstairs to gather Helen's belongings. Her reading glasses, a silk scarf, and a photo of a man in military uniform. Helen's late husband. Grace noticed something else. On the bedside table lay an unfinished crossword puzzle and a note in neat handwriting that read, Kindness is the only wealth we can't lose. The words hit her like a wave. For the first time in months, she sat on the edge of Helen's bed and cried. Not from exhaustion or anger, but from something deeper. The realization of what she'd been missing. It wasn't money or comfort. It was the sense of being human again, of caring for someone without expecting anything in return. That evening, Grace visited Helen at the hospital. The room smelled of antiseptic and wilted flowers. Helen looked smaller in the hospital bed, but her spirit was still there, bright in her tired eyes. You didn't have to come, she whispered. Grace smiled. I wanted to. Helen chuckled weakly. You sound like your mother now. Grace hesitated before speaking. You knew her well. Was she really happy? Helen's expression softened. Evelyn never chased happiness. She built peace, piece by piece. There's a difference. As Grace left the hospital, the rain had stopped. The clouds parted just enough for a sliver of light to touch the wet pavement. She walked home slowly, her shoes squelching, her heart strangely calm. For the first time, she understood something Evelyn had once said, that pain can be a teacher. It didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like cleansing. Back at her small, rented room, she brewed tea and sat by the window. The ocean was dark but still, stretching endlessly under the half-hidden moon. She imagined her mother at home, maybe reading by the fire, pretending not to worry. The thought brought a faint smile to her lips. She picked up her phone and typed a short message, hesitated, then deleted it. Instead, she whispered into the quiet room, Thank you, Mom, for letting me find this on my own. Evelyn, miles away, sat on her porch that same night. She looked toward the horizon as if she could hear the words carried by the wind. Her heart eased, and for the first time since Grace had left, she smiled. The early morning sun poured gently through the curtains of Helen's small apartment, painting soft lines across the faded carpet. Outside, the city moved with its usual rhythm. Honking cars, distant laughter, and the faint smell of coffee from the shop downstairs. Inside, however, the silence between Grace and Helen was thick, fragile, and trembling with unspoken words. Grace sat at the corner of the small round table, her fingers nervously circling the rim of a chipped porcelain cup. Her once polished nails were now uneven, showing signs of restless nights and endless work shifts. Her hair, once sleek and styled, fell loosely around her face, its dark strands framing eyes that had learned the weight of humility. Helen, seated across from her, looked weaker than Grace remembered. Her silver hair was tied into a small bun, and her wrinkled hands trembled slightly as she lifted her cup of tea. Yet there was a strange calm in her eyes, a quiet dignity that even time and pain couldn't erase. She had the air of a woman who had lived too many lives within one. "You've changed, Grace," Helen said softly, her voice low but steady. "There's a light in your eyes again, though it's not the same one you used to have." Grace lowered her gaze. "Maybe because I finally see what matters." The silence returned, stretching between them like an invisible thread. Helen took a deep breath, as if summoning the courage to speak something long hidden. "There's something you need to know," she began, setting her cup down. "About your mother." Grace frowned slightly. "What about her?" Helen's eyes softened, filled with the weight of secrets kept too long. "When you came to me that first day, desperate and angry, I called Evelyn." Grace froze. You called her?" "Yes," Helen said, her tone unwavering. "I told her about your situation, about the debts, the eviction. And do you know what she said?" Grace's voice shook. "What?" Helen leaned forward slightly. "She said she could pay it all, right then, every cent, but she refused to." Grace's breath hitched. The world seemed to tilt, her mind struggling to catch up. "She could have saved me," she whispered, her throat tightening. "She could have stopped everything." Helen nodded. "Yes, but she didn't. Not because she didn't love you, but because she did." Grace shook her head violently. "That doesn't make sense. How is letting me suffer love?" Helen's expression grew gentle, like a grandmother trying to explain something painful to a child. "Because Evelyn saw what I couldn't. She knew you had to learn what no amount of money could teach, how to stand without being saved." Grace's mind spiraled with memories. Her mother's silence during her worst days, the rejection that had felt so cruel, the bitter loneliness that had carved her into something sharper. For the first time, those memories shifted shape. They no longer looked like cruelty. They looked like lessons. Tears welled in her eyes, burning with both anger and understanding. "She wanted me to fall," Grace whispered, almost to herself. "She wanted me to fall so I could stand again." "Exactly," Helen said softly. "Sometimes love looks like distance. Sometimes it's silence. But it's still love, Grace." Grace stared at Helen, her heart a storm of regret and gratitude colliding at once. "I thought she stopped caring about me," she said, her voice trembling. "All those nights I hated her. I didn't know she was still watching." Helen smiled faintly. "She never stopped. She asked me to keep an eye on you, to make sure you'd be safe, even if you didn't see her." A heavy sob broke from Grace's chest. She pressed her palms to her face, unable to stop the flood. For the first time, she wasn't crying out of anger, but from the unbearable tenderness of truth. Helen reached out, her frail hand resting over Grace's. "Go home, dear," she said gently. "Tell her what you just learned." Later that evening, Grace stood outside her mother's house, the same house she had left in fury weeks ago. The garden was still neat, the air smelled faintly of lavender, and the porch light flickered softly. Her heart pounded as she lifted her hand and knocked. The door opened slowly. Evelyn stood there, wearing a light cardigan, her hair tied loosely behind her head. Time had left its marks, faint wrinkles near her eyes, silver glimmers in her dark hair. But her posture was still composed, elegant in its restraint. "Grace," she said quietly. Her voice carried both surprise and something softer, relief. For a moment, neither moved. Then Grace took a small step forward, her eyes glistening. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I understand now." Evelyn's expression faltered, emotion flickering across her usually calm face. Grace fell to her knees, tears streaming freely. "You could have saved me," she said, her words tumbling through sobs. "But you didn't. And now I know why. You wanted me to save myself. You wanted me to see who I was without everything I thought I needed." Evelyn's lips quivered. "Grace, I hated you for it," Grace continued, choking on the words. "But now, I see. You gave me the only gift that mattered. You let me lose, so I could find myself." Evelyn's composure finally cracked. She knelt beside her daughter and pulled her into her arms. The embrace was trembling, desperate, and long overdue. They cried together, not as mother and daughter divided by pride, but as two broken souls finally meeting in the same pain. In that moment, the years of misunderstanding melted away. Evelyn whispered into Grace's hair, "I never stopped loving you. I just needed you to learn to love yourself first." Grace nodded, her face pressed against her mother's shoulder. "I know," she whispered. "I know now." Outside, the night settled quietly over them. The stars above shone faintly through the dark, and the sound of the wind through the trees carried a peace neither had known for years. Inside that small house, two hearts began to heal. Slowly, honestly, beautifully. They remained in that embrace until the silence between them no longer hurt. Just before dawn, Evelyn smiled through tears. "Welcome home, Grace." Grace looked at her, exhausted but lighter than she had been in years. "I am home, Mom," she whispered. Finally. The morning breeze from the sea carried a soft scent of salt and wildflowers, sweeping gently through the open windows of the old Carter beach house. Seagulls circled lazily above the waves, and the rhythmic crash of the tide against the rocks felt like the steady heartbeat of something alive, something reborn. The once quiet house was no longer silent. It hummed with voices, laughter, and the sound of footsteps that belonged to women rebuilding their lives. A new sign hung proudly above the whitewashed door. "Harbor Home, a place to begin again." Grace stood in the small kitchen, sunlight warming her freckled cheeks. She wore a simple linen dress, her hair tied back loosely, and around her neck hung a silver pendant in the shape of a compass, a graduation gift from Evelyn. A year had passed since she had returned home, and though her heart still carried the echoes of her struggles, she had transformed that pain into purpose. On the wall beside her hung a framed certificate. Grace Carter, Certified Social Counselor. It had taken endless nights of studying, working, and facing her fears, but she had done it. She had finally built something on her own. Across the kitchen, a young woman with auburn curls named Mira Thompson was preparing tea. Mira, only 22, had been one of the first residents of Harbor Home. Her pale skin was marked with faint scars from a past she rarely spoke of, a controlling marriage she had escaped months ago. Yet now, there was light in her hazel eyes again, a quiet courage that grew stronger each day. "You've got that look again," Mira said playfully, glancing at Grace. "The one you get when you're thinking too much." Grace smiled, shaking her head. "Maybe, just grateful, I suppose." Mira handed her a cup of tea and leaned on the counter. "You should be. You built all this. Evelyn might have started the foundation, but Harbor Home, that's your heartbeat." Grace's throat tightened at the compliment. "I didn't build it alone," she said softly. "None of this would exist without the people who believed in it." The two women shared a quiet smile before the sound of laughter drifted in from outside. Through the window, Grace could see two more residents, Janet and Lila, tending the garden. Janet, A middle-aged woman with short blonde hair and a round face had come to the home after losing her business to debt. She was known for her hearty laugh and her way of making everyone feel like family. Lila, barely 19, was shy and often kept her gaze low. But when she smiled, it was like sunrise breaking through fog. Watching them now, Grace felt something warm bloom in her chest. Pride, peace, and the strange ache of healing. A voice from the doorway made her turn. "You always did love watching people grow." Evelyn stood there, her gray hair shining softly in the afternoon light. She was dressed in her usual grace, a white blouse and beige trousers. Her posture still elegant but gentler than before. Time had softened her, though her eyes remained as sharp as ever. "Mom," Grace said, setting down her cup. "You're early." "Old habits," Evelyn said with a faint smile. "I came to see how my daughter and her dream were doing." Grace laughed lightly. "They're both surviving somehow." Evelyn stepped closer, her gaze sweeping over the busy home. "It's beautiful," she said. "When your father left this house to us, I never imagined it would become something like this." Grace followed her gaze toward the open living room, now filled with bookshelves, art supplies, and a large notice board covered in motivational notes written by the residents. On one, someone had scribbled, "You are not your past. You are your beginning." Evelyn reached out, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table where photographs of the residents sat in simple frames. "Thomas would have loved this," she said quietly. "He always believed a home should have laughter." Grace looked at her mother with tenderness. "You made that possible, Mom. You turned his memory into a foundation that saves people." Evelyn smiled, though her eyes shimmered with emotion. "I just gave them the keys, darling. You built the doors." For a moment, the two women stood there, surrounded by the living pulse of Harbor Home. Every sound, the clink of cups, the chatter from the garden, the soft strum of a guitar somewhere upstairs, was proof that their pain had birthed something good. Later, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in amber and rose, Grace and Evelyn sat together on the front porch. The sea stretched endlessly before them, shimmering gold under the fading light. The waves whispered softly against the shore, as if carrying the stories of every woman who had ever stepped through their door. Grace tucked her legs beneath her, holding a warm mug between her palms. "Do you ever think," she began softly, "that if things hadn't gone so wrong before, we wouldn't be here now?" Evelyn chuckled, her voice husky with age. "I think about it often. But I also think sometimes we have to lose everything to understand what home really means." Grace nodded. "When I was out there, lost, angry, broke, I thought you were cruel. I thought you stopped loving me." She looked down at the rippling reflection of the sky on the sea. "But now I know you were saving me in the only way that mattered." Evelyn turned her head, her eyes gleaming with pride. "And you saved me too, Grace. I had forgotten how to believe in people again. Watching you rise reminded me that love isn't about control. It's about faith." Grace smiled faintly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You didn't save me with money, Mom. You saved me with the truth." Evelyn reached over, resting a gentle hand over hers. "And you saved me with love." The sun dipped lower, the sky deepening into shades of violet and orange. The sound of the waves merged with the laughter of the women inside, and for the first time in years, Evelyn felt the ache in her chest ease completely. She glanced at her daughter, the woman she had once feared losing, and saw not the fragile girl who had left in anger, but a woman forged in resilience, radiant in her purpose. You did well, Grace, she said softly. Your father would have been proud. Grace leaned her head against Evelyn's shoulder. I hope so. I think he would have liked seeing this house full again. Evelyn nodded. He would have loved it. As twilight descended, the lights from the house began to glow warmly, spilling golden beams across the sand. Inside, someone started singing softly, a melody about finding one's way home. Grace closed her eyes, listening. Do you hear that? She whispered. Evelyn smiled. Yes, she said. That's the sound of hope. And as the last light of day faded into night, the two women sat together, mother and daughter, teacher and student, builder and believer, their silhouettes framed against the vast sea that had once separated them and now brought them back together.